So what these baroreceptors do is they send a constant tone of afferent action potentials back to the control center, like that. And these afferent action potentials are kind of calibrated for a certain blood pressure that the baroreceptors like, that your control center likes, that your body likes. We like that blood pressure, and as long as this frequency of action potentials is coming back, so this frequency right here, as long as it's coming back kind of like this, then we're good. But if you have an increased blood pressure situation, these baroreceptors are going to start firing at a much more intense frequency. When that higher frequency hits the control center, it's going to tell the control center that the blood pressure is too high, and then two things will happen after that. It's going to tell the parasympathetic nervous system to increase, and it's going to tell the sympathetic nervous system to decrease. But in the background, the parasympathetic nervous system was kind of already firing from that normal tone, and when we tell it to increase, it's going to increase its action potentials. The sympathetic nervous system was also kind of firing at a slower rate, and when we get this message from the control center, which came from the baroreceptor saying, hey, there's too much blood pressure, we're going to tell the sympathetic nervous system to slow down as well. And I hope you can kind of see the contrast between these two that I've drawn here. That these action potentials would not look like this if a computer had traced them, if we were measuring this, but I hope you can kind of get why I drew them like that. I was trying to make them look like they were slowing down. And so one other kind of big misconception I wanted to clear up is that sometimes we think of the parasympathetic nervous system and the sympathetic nervous system as being total opposites, and they are. But the problem with that is that we sometimes think that they're kind of like light switches, like we turn the parasympathetic on and we turn the sympathetic completely off. But back when the baroreceptors were just firing that normal rhythm and everything was okay, before we increased the parasympathetic or decreased the sympathetic, I wanted to be clear that both the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous systems were acting on the heart. And it's kind of the same way for every tissue in your body that the autonomic nervous system works on. It's not like you turn the parasympathetic completely on and you turn the sympathetic completely off. It's more like tonal control, kind of like volume knobs on a stereo, or like bass and treble knobs. There are various settings where you could leave the bass at or the treble at to your liking. And the parasympathetic and sympathetic, neither one of them are ever completely off. It's just which one is in more control at the moment. Hopefully that what I just said made some sense. So what happens when you have a decreased blood pressure situation? So under a decreased blood pressure situation, you're going to have these regular tonal action potentials that we talked about for normal blood pressure go down. They would be moving slower. And I understand what I'm about to draw is probably just going to look like a mess. But I'm trying to show that they would be going slower. Again, obviously they wouldn't really look like this in an actual tracing. Let me try that one again. Be kind of going slow. If what I'm drawing is confusing, just ignore it and listen to what I'm saying. They're going slow. And by the time they hit the control center can tell that there is not as high a frequency of action potential as there would normally be. And they're going to tell what that means to the control center is that there's a decreased blood pressure situation. The reason it means that, and I kind of didn't mention this when we went through the high blood pressure situation, is because these baroreceptors, like we've said a couple times so far, are mechanoreceptors, meaning that they can detect stretch. If you have more blood coming through this tube, if you have a lot of blood coming through here, then these receptors are going to really stretch, just like water moving through a hose. More water coming through the hose means the hose is going to be more taut and stiff and more pressure, and conversely, less water moving through a hose, it would be more flaccid and loose and not as taut and not have as much pressure. And these mechanoreceptors, the more pressure they feel, the more they stretch, the more action potentials they send. And so in the first scenario, in that high blood pressure situation, that's why they ended up with these really increased action potentials. But in the low blood pressure situation, I tried to draw them coming in slow, and I get that failed, but just know that they would be coming in much less because there's less stretch. And I hope that makes sense. Well, if they're coming in less, then the control center is going to want to increase blood pressure by taking this normal rhythm from the parasympathetic nervous system, right? And it's going to want to try and slow this pig down. I hope it kind of looks like I'm trying to slow it down. If it doesn't, again, I mean that it's slowing down. And then you have the normal sympathetic situation, and this control center is going to tell this normal frequency of action potentials, hey, you got to speed up. Speed up, speed up, speed up, get all the way to the heart, and increase the amount of norepinephrine hitting the SA node. So more norepinephrine hitting the SA node in here is going to increase heart rate. More acetylcholine from the parasympathetic nervous system would have decreased the heart rate. And since cardiac output is equal to heart rate times stroke volume, we'll talk about stroke volume on a different day. If you increase the heart rate, you increase cardiac output. Conversely, if you were to decrease the heart rate, you would decrease cardiac output. And since cardiac output, I shouldn't say E is equal to, since cardiac output is very, very related to blood pressure, the more cardiac output you have, the higher blood pressure you will have. And so, now that we know enough about this system to be dangerous, let's go ahead and see if we can get a little more dangerous. And in the next video, in part 2, let's see if we can kind of mess with my baroreceptors and see if we can get my body to respond in real time. I just wanted to clarify at the very end of this that we are oversimplifying this a little bit, but I think we've got enough to get the job done.